The claim holds up because Ecclesiastes 12:13 presents itself as the conclusion of the entire book. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. This verse doesn't merely close out one particular book of Scripture. It announces itself as the sum of a search, the destination of a meditation that has walked through the whole of human existence before distilling it down to two demands. The Hebrew here uses a phrase that means, quite literally, the end of the matter, all has been heard. In other words, the preacher, Koheleth in Hebrew, has examined everything, weighed everything, exhausted everything, and only after that vast inventory does he dare to state his final sentence. So this is not some stray thought tossed into the middle of a chapter. It is a ripened conclusion, wrung out of the most clear-eyed and disillusioned experience anywhere in the Bible. And what makes this verse so remarkable is precisely where it comes from. It doesn't spring from the enthusiasm of a prophet or the fervor of a psalmist, but from the mouth of the one man who tried everything and found it all empty. Before arriving here, the preacher has run through pleasure, wealth, work, knowledge, and power, repeating like a relentless refrain that all of it is vanity of vanities, a breath that passes under the sun. Anyone who has read Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises has met that phrase secondhand. The title itself is lifted straight from Ecclesiastes, and felt the same weary ache Koheleth describes. It is out of that same soil of bitterness that a sober, definitive certainty finally rises. If these reflections on Scripture are useful to your own journey, I'd invite you to subscribe to the channel. A small gesture, but one that genuinely helps this work reach others. It's worth pausing on that Hebrew word, hevel, which our English Bibles render as vanity. It doesn't first mean moral emptiness, but vapor, mist, breath, the thing that vanishes the instant you try to grasp it. Koheleth isn't saying life is meaningless. He's saying it slips through your fingers, that nothing under the sun can be held onto or made to last. Work piles up and scatters. Even wisdom cannot outrun death. The memory of men fades. Everything a person builds, someone else will inherit, and he won't even know whether that heir will be wise or a fool. This kind of clarity could easily lead to despair, and yet, at the end of the road, the preacher does not collapse. He turns. He lifts his gaze away from everything under the sun toward the one who is above the sun. That is the whole key to the book. Meaning is not found in things, which pass, but in relationship with God, who remains. This is why the verse can rightly be called a summary of the whole Bible. Not because it contains, all by itself, the entirety of Revelation, we'll come to its limits in a moment, but because it draws the immense diversity of Scripture back to its essential movement. From the opening pages of Genesis to the final words of the prophets, the Bible keeps asking the same question in 1,000 forms. What does man owe to God, and where does he find his true place? The answer that Ecclesiastes condenses into a single line is the one the entire wisdom tradition had been preparing. Fear God and keep his commandments. Those two verbs, by themselves, gather up the very best of what the Old Testament set out to hand down. And so it's worth stopping, understanding each of these words, and letting this ancient sentence throw light on our own lives. Consider first the opening demand, fear God. The word can grate on the modern ear, which readily links fear with terror, with threat, with a religion of dread. But the fear Scripture speaks of has nothing to do with a slave's anxiety before his master. It names the right posture of the heart before the Holy One, that blend of reverence, wonder, and humility that seizes a person when he becomes aware that he stands before the infinite. The wisdom tradition is unanimous here. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, proclaims the book of Proverbs in chapter 9, verse 10, and Psalm 111, verse 10 says exactly the same thing. Fear is not the opposite of love. It is its threshold. You can only truly love what you first respect in its greatness. This fear, then, is the doorway into all authentic spiritual life. It sets a person in his proper place, neither crushed nor puffed up, but at worship. The great English convert John Henry Newman, canonized a saint in 2019, captured it perfectly with the motto he took as a cardinal, cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks to heart. Reverence is not distance from God, but the beginning of intimacy with him. Grasping that fear is the beginning of wisdom and not its enemy changes everything about how we read the Bible. It means the highest knowledge is not the accumulation of facts, but the recognition of who God is and who we are before him. The biblical sage is not, first of all, the learned man, but the rightly ordered man, the one who has understood the deep order of things. All the wisdom literature, Proverbs, Job, the Psalms, Ecclesiastes itself, unfolds from this first conviction. In varied forms, it tells the same truth, that whoever loses the sense of God will, sooner or later, lose the sense of himself and of the world as well. The fear of God, then, is no passing emotion, but a permanent orientation of one's whole existence, an inner compass that keeps a person from mistaking himself for the center of everything. Then comes the second demand, inseparable from the first. keep his commandments. If fear is the principle, obedience is the fruit. It is not enough to acknowledge God's greatness inwardly. That acknowledgement has to translate into conduct, into action, into the concrete choices of each day. The Catholic tradition has always insisted on this unity. Faith that does not take flesh and works remains barren, and obedience that does not spring from a heart inhabited by God is mere empty legalism. The two belong together like root and fruit. Here you might think of Dorothy Day, the American servant of God who fed the hungry in the breadlines of New York. She loved to say that the greatest challenge of the day is how to bring about a revolution of the heart. And her whole life was the refusal to separate what so many want to keep apart. Inner adoration and outward action, the heart and the hands, what one believes and what one does. That is exactly why this verse can claim to sum up the Bible, because all of Scripture swings between these two poles and never stops demanding their agreement. We touch here on a balance that religious history has often broken. Some have wanted to reduce religion to inner feeling, to a disembodied piety that costs the life nothing. Others, at the opposite extreme, have locked it inside the scrupulous keeping of rules until the heart was forgotten. The prophets of Israel rose up against both distortions. Isaiah reproached the people for honoring God with their lips, while their hearts stayed far from him. The same prophets kept insisting that sacrifices count for nothing without justice toward one's neighbor. Ecclesiastes, in his more sober way, recovers that same balance. Fear God, there is the heart. Keep his commandments, there are the hands. To separate the two is to betray both. To hold them together is to walk upright before God. If this line of thought resonates with you, take a moment to subscribe. It lets these reflections find their way to others searching for meaning. It's worth noticing, too, that this verse is not addressed only to a handful of insiders. For this is the whole duty of man, the text specifies. The sentence is reserved neither for priests, nor for sages, nor for the people of Israel alone. It concerns man as such, every man, without distinction of condition or era. That is what gives it a properly universal reach. To fear God and keep his commandments is not one religious specialty among a person's other activities. It is presented as the very reason for existence, the vocation written into the depths of every human being. The preacher does not say this is an option offered to those who might care for it. He affirms that it is the whole duty of man, in other words, the very thing man was made for. And notice that this duty is not laid out as a crushing burden, but as a fulfillment, as the place where existence finally finds its coherence. This is where the most disillusioned book in the Bible reveals itself, paradoxically, as one of the most luminous. Having shown that nothing, absolutely nothing under the sun, can satisfy the human heart, it arrives not at nothingness, but at God. The vanity of all things was never an end in itself. It was the long, necessary road for clearing the eyes, for tearing a person away from his false idols and turning him toward the one solid foundation. In this sense, Ecclesiastes anticipates an intuition the whole Christian tradition will take up, that the human heart stays restless until it rests in God. St. Augustine, in the opening pages of his Confessions, says precisely this: man searches everywhere for what is found nowhere but in his Creator. The preacher, centuries before the gospel, had already sensed that truth at the end of his exhausting quest. Now it remains to understand how this verse, profound as it is, does not exhaust the whole richness of Revelation, and why it must be read in the light of what comes after it. For if Ecclesiastes 12:13 expresses the summit of Old Testament wisdom, it also marks, in a certain way, its limit. It represents the voice of human reason enlightened by faith, arrived at the highest point it could reach before the full manifestation of God in Jesus Christ. And it is precisely this tension between fulfillment and expectation that gives the verse all its savor for a Christian reader. We have to be honest on this point because it's a question the tradition of the Church invites us to weigh with some nuance. When we say this verse sums up the whole Bible, we are not claiming to lock the entirety of Revelation inside a closed formula. The Bible is not a system of ideas that could be boiled down to a single maxim. It is first of all the story of a covenant, the record of an encounter between God and men, which culminates not in a sentence, but in a person. To say that Ecclesiastes sums up Scripture is to recognize that it expresses its fundamental movement from reverent fear to obedient life, while knowing that this movement will be transfigured, raised up, and fulfilled by Christ. The verse is like the summit of the older wisdom, from which one already glimpses, far off, the light about to dawn. For what Ecclesiastes calls fearing God, the gospel will bring to its fullness by transforming it into filial love. Servile fear, the dread of the slave who fears punishment, is only a first stage. Christ reveals a God who is not merely the Almighty before whom one trembles, but the Father toward whom one runs. The fear remains, but it changes in nature. It becomes that loving reverence of the child who fears, not to lose his life, but to wound the love. In the same way, Keeping the commandments will no longer be, first of all, the observance of an external law, but the response of a heart transformed by grace. Christ himself will sum up the whole law and the prophets in the twofold commandment of love of God and love of neighbor, as the gospel according to Matthew records in chapter 22. What Ecclesiastes had condensed into the sober language of wisdom, the gospel unfolds in the language of love. It was that discovery that the whole weight of the law hangs on love that so undid the young Cistercian monk Thomas Merton, the Kentucky writer whose The Seven-Story Mountain introduced a whole American generation to the idea that the restless heart Augustine described was their own. So, far from making the verse obsolete, the gospel reveals its deepest truth. Ecclesiastes was right. Everything comes down to fearing God and keeping his commandments. But we now know, in the light of Christ, what those words mean in all their depth. To fear God is to adore him as Father. To keep his commandments is to love as he has loved us. The sentence of the Old Testament receives its full illumination from the New, the way a sketch receives its colors. This is why the Christian tradition has never set Ecclesiastes aside. It has always recognized in it a necessary voice that of human wisdom arrived at its end, standing humble and clear-eyed at the threshold of the fuller revelation. There is a precious lesson to draw from all this for our own lives. We live in a world saturated with offers that promise happiness under the sun, success, possession, pleasure, recognition, the very things the American storyteller F. Scott Fitzgerald dressed in green light at the end of Gatsby's dock, forever reaching and never grasping. Ecclesiastes, with a clarity that hasn't aged today, warns us that none of it can ever satisfy the human heart, because all of it passes like a mist. His final sentence is not pessimism, but liberation. It invites us to stop searching where there is nothing to find, and to turn toward the one who alone remains. To fear God and keep his commandments is not to deprive oneself of life. It is, at last, to receive it in its truth. The reader who meditates on this verse does not close the Bible on a formula. On the contrary, he reopens it in all its depth, invited to travel once more, from Genesis to the Gospel, that long human search for meaning that finds its only answer in God. Perhaps that is the loveliest paradox of this little verse. It presents itself as a conclusion, a full stop, the end of the whole matter. And yet it works like an opening. By drawing all of Scripture back to its heart, it does not impoverish it. It hands us the key to reading it. Whoever has understood that it comes down in the end to fearing God and keeping his commandments can reread every page of the Bible with fresh eyes and recognize everywhere that same movement of the human heart toward its Creator. That is what makes Ecclesiastes 12:13 truly deserve to be called the verse that holds the whole Bible together, not because it replaces the rest, but because it delivers its meaning and sends us back, enlightened to the whole. Thank you for taking the time to sit with this passage all the way to the end. If this journey has nourished you, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the reflections still to come. And may this ancient wisdom keep lighting your way.